I can't say that all my life I hadn't been warned about the girls in the Maitland family. Everyone around me knew about them. A Maitland girl will always be beautiful. A Maitland girl will always be smart and funny. And she will make you head over heels in reckless excitement about her. But most importantly, a Maitland girl will always be unfaithful. As my mom would say, they just didn't have any consistency in them. And of course, she warned me many times about those Maitland girls. Their entire clan, she insisted, had been sent to this earth by the devil himself to confuse men and set insidious traps for them. According to Mom, they could hypnotize men with their captivating gazes, gentle words, and constantly swaying hips. No matter what last name they took when they married, O'Malley, Smith, Robard, it would never change their nature. They were always Maitland girls, and always, like moths, would rush out of their seats without a second thought and rush after the brighter light, the momentary pleasure. They said that if you got involved with a girl from the Maitland family, you'd better take a closer look at your children to see who their real father was. Constancy isn't about them. So as I slowly walked up the path to the porch of my farmhouse, I was hardly surprised to see my wife Jenny standing next to my best friend Mark, with his baby daughter perched on one hip, waving her arms funny in an attempt to keep her balance. My son Tommy peeked out from behind Jenny's blue chintz dress, eyeing me warily, confused and lost. Mark, on the other hand, was gently touching my son's shoulder, while his cheekbones were tense and his jaw was resolutely clenched, like a man who sees a storm coming and knows it's coming. Jenny was frozen between admiration and horror, her eyes wide in disbelief, and her hands stretched forward as if she wanted and feared to touch me across the last few meters separating us, trying to make sure I was real, or not real. As a kid, I obeyed my mom. I stayed away from the fickle girls of the Maitland clan and their magnetically appealing eyes. Though, of course, I saw them. They were like living, sparkling comets, glittering against the prim and God-fearing citizens of our county. They flitted from one boy to another while in school, and from man to man outside of it. My best friend Mark and I had heard plenty of stories about the Maitland girls and their lust for pleasure from guys older than ours, the ones who fell in love with them and were rejected. The only Maitland girl close to our age was Jenny Maitland, a clear-eyed, incredibly sweet girl who never stuck around the same guy for more than 4 months. We'd occasionally exchanged a few words with her, friendly enough, but I prudently stayed away from her until she ran off to the city, in pursuit of something the Maitland girls were always looking for. By then, I was beginning to worry that I might have become the next target on Jenny's list of conquests, and my mom would nail me if I got involved with one of the Maitland girls. So I breathed a big sigh of relief when she disappeared from school one day. I never found another suitable girl, though, and when I finally came of age after my mother died of a fever, I set out on an adventure, enlisting in the Navy before it was time for me to settle down, put down roots, and farm the fertile lands of southern Indiana. Mark would have joined the Army with me, but at the age of 4, he lost half his foot to a carelessly dropped axe. He talked me into going and enlisting in the Navy, though, so I could break out into the big world and have some fun for both of us. So for 4 years, I traveled all over the world, sailing the seas in a white sailor's uniform and working in the radio room of a cruiser, even though I always knew I would be coming home. All this time, I was constantly sending my best friend postcards and letters from my wanderings. The Philippines, Macau, Hong Kong, Singapore, Fiji, Hawaii, San Francisco. I met a lot of girls, mostly from exotic places, but I don't think my mom would have approved of any of them. Still, meeting them was fun. Eventually, I realized I had to go back. Because I missed farming so much, the fertile soil, the seeds, and the solid ground that didn't wobble under my feet. Mark met me at the station, in the midst of the stifling summer heat, and we walked to Mrs. Strickland's boarding house. Mark used to stay there when he was in town on business. He worked for a delivery service in a shoelace factory and was always traveling to different towns in the county, sometimes making his way to the big city. Mark met half a dozen girls at various points along his routes, but he wasn't serious about any of them. Mark chattered on and on about the postcards he'd received from me as I carried my sea bag to his room, now shared by both of us. Then he stopped and stopped talking, and there was a sly but a little sad expression on his face. You'd better hurry up, John. Dinner will be served in the main hall in 10 minutes, and you'd better not miss it. Mrs. Strickland hates guests who can't get to the table on time. So come on, buddy. Move your feet. You don't want to miss this dinner. The way he said it struck me as a little odd, and I was still puzzling over his words after the prayer while the food was being brought out of the kitchen by a shy girl with disheveled hair and lifeless, sunken eyes. The food itself wasn't bad, but it wasn't so wonderfully good that it would be a tragedy to miss it. It was simple and hearty, though the portions themselves were generous. Mark nodded toward the kitchen, where once again the girl had disappeared, looking like a broken, frightened mouse. You recognized who it was, didn't you? Leaning closer, he asked in a muffled voice. I shook my head. Come on, John, think again, Mark insisted. When I still couldn't get anything out of my memory, he sighed. It's Jenny Maitland, he informed me, arching an eyebrow meaningfully. Bullshit, I blurted out, unable to believe what I was hearing, even if he were thrice my friend. Never had a Maitland girl been so intimidated and lifeless. Mark looked back toward the kitchen door. I meant it. She came back from the big city in this condition about 2 years ago, and she hardly talks at all. Don't you dare touch her. It might freak her out. One time I accidentally touched her hand when I was taking a piece of roll, and she ran out of the room crying. But I stopped, not knowing what to say. It seemed simply impossible that the cheerful light that had always been inherent in them had faded in one of the girls of the Maitland clan. And Mark was originally, by nature, a gentle soul, one of the kindest people I'd ever known. No one could fear him. I know. My friend nodded understandingly. He had non-verbally sensed everything I wanted to say, so words were often unnecessary for us. We both waited for her to come back and bring dessert. As she placed a slice of red velvet one on my plate with trembling hands, I whispered her name. Jenny? She flinched, nearly knocking the cake over, and then she recoiled, looking at me with a startled stare, like a dog that had been kicked in the side. And she never answered me. I lowered my eyes and pretended I hadn't noticed her reaction, even though we both knew I hadn't. It's good to see you, Jenny. It's been a long time since we were in high school, I said softly. She shuddered again, as if someone had walked over her grave. She seemed a little numb, watching me warily. John? It was a long time ago. When did you come back? Her voice was shaky and stammering and so unfamiliar, like old paper that had been folded too long and no longer wanted to be opened. I looked up at her again, but this time I tried not to stare too intently into her dark eyes. Just got back from the Navy. We'll be looking for a farm to buy her. I really miss picking at the ground. That's nice, she struggled to say. She hesitated for a second, mumbled something I couldn't hear, and ran out of the room. Mark stared at me, his head tilted to the side. Wow. He stretched out in surprise. That's the most I've heard from her since she came back. She's barely spoken to me at all. Now I understood what Mark had been implying before dinner. He'd always had a thing for lost kittens. When we were growing up, he talked me into returning more than one lost chick back to its parents' nests. Despite some internal resistance on my part, Jenny became as much a project for me as finding a suitable farm. At first, I was just trying to get her to start smiling again. Every day at dinner, I whispered a few words to her, told her about the wonders of Hawaii and China that I'd seen. Not the girls, of course, but the outlandish birds and marvelous flowers. My descriptions of the huge, crowded Asian cities made Jenny shiver and pale. All the while she was wary, as if fearing something bad. But eventually, Jenny began to look less tense and even began to initiate our short conversations herself. We found our ritual becoming a habit. A short conversation while she cleared away the dessert plates and brought coffee. Just 4 or 5 phrases, which we exchanged cautiously at some safe distance from each other. Jenny never passed anything directly to anyone. She put the dishes on the table or took them from the table, always keeping a certain distance. If she felt any discomfort, She would run out of the room and hide in the kitchen, and it took months to even get that far. Mark had been on his route for a couple days now when I finally decided that Jenny Maitland had to start smiling, or I was going to lose my mind. I rummaged thoroughly through my sea bag until I found a bunch of embroidered silk ribbons. I'd picked up handfuls of them in Hong Kong and given them to girls in Hawaii just for fun. I picked one out of all of them, the one I thought would fit her. It was nothing fancy, a light blue silk ribbon trimmed with gold trim, with cute songbirds embroidered across the field. I was alone there. Mark wasn't in the dining room, so when she brought my pie from the kitchen and set it on the table, I pulled the ribbon out of my pocket. "Jenny!" I called out to her. This girl had been looking at me with less wariness for some time now. She was starting to trust me, but I wasn't sure that trust would ever be complete. "John." Like an echo, she responded in a quiet voice, standing next to the table. Her restless fingers lightly rubbed the edges of her apron. I held out the ribbon to her. "You know, it's not much, but I can't help but think it would look much better in your hair than at the bottom of my sea bag." She looked at the ribbon with slight surprise as she craned her neck, and there was a tiny spark in her eyes that reminded her of that old Maitland girl. She reached out her hand to it, even for a second, unhesitatingly. "It's from Hong Kong." I could only utter a few words. Panic suddenly contorted her face, and she rushed into the kitchen. I'd always left Jenny alone before, but something inside told me that right now the girl needed someone to follow her to help her. I hastily pushed back my chair and rushed after her. Jenny was huddled back against the cabinets in the far corner of the kitchen, struggling to stand on trembling legs, but shrinking back into nothingness. She tried to hold back the sobs that came out in convulsive sobs through clenched teeth. Her eyes were desperately squeezed shut, but tears were streaming from beneath her lashes. I stopped a few feet away from her and knelt down. "Jenny," I said very softly, as quietly as I could. Her eyes flew open, and she looked around in wild panic, panting, before lowering her gaze and staring at me kneeling in front of her. Whatever it was, whatever happened, Jenny, I didn't do it. My voice was still quiet and soothing. I held the ribbon up in front of me. "It's just a ribbon and I can't use it, but you can." Her still crazed eyes followed the ribbon like a venomous cobra aimed at her. "It's yours, Jenny. All you have to do is take it. It's a gift for you, from friend to friend." I think it took all the strength of her body, mind, and soul to cover a distance of less than a meter. But what seemed like 1,000 miles, to reach out again and grasp with two timid, trembling fingers just the very tip of the ribbon. Keeping on my knees, I crawled back just as carefully and then slowly rose to my feet and walked back to my pirogue. Not looking in her direction, avoiding eye contact and fiercely hating a world that could hurt and fracture anyone so badly. She never returned from the kitchen, and I didn't see her for 2 days. Mrs. Strickland served me, continuing to throw strange, wordless glances in my direction that I couldn't decipher. On the 3rd day, another girl, a little more ruddy, served me, and her hair was tied up in a light blue ribbon with a gold border. "That ribbon suits you very well, Jenny," I remarked. The girl smiled faintly. She was still shy and unsure, but it was the first smile I had ever seen from her. Every day got better after that. Mark was conspiring with me and, in some ways, against me. His plan was more strategic and far-reaching than mine, and I didn't realize it for a while. Mark wanted to save Jenny, seeing her as just another lost fledgling, but just as he saw how happy I was to help her, and he managed, time after time, to disappear at just the right moment, giving us time to be together longer. Eventually, she was able to overcome her inner demons and touched my hand. And after a while, those touches became a habit. I saw Jenny as more than a bring-back-to-life project, more than just a friend. I teased her a little, and she even managed to tease me a little in return. It was just before Christmas when I told her that all I wanted for Christmas was a kiss on the cheek. She immediately turned pale, but then instead of running off to the kitchen, she pulled her chair over to mine at the table where I was sitting. "John." She raised her hand, stopping me when she saw I wanted to say something. Her voice was firm, almost icy. "I appreciate everything you've done, but you know that I'm a Maitland's girl, and everyone knows that Maitland girls don't bring good luck to anyone. They're just trouble." I reached out and took her hand. She flinched, but let me touch her, and even squeezed her hand tightly for a moment. "I'm different, Jenny, and I don't think you're the problem," I said with heartfelt conviction. She lowered her gaze, closing her eyes. Her voice, when it broke again, sounded hopelessly dead. I'm ruined, John. I wouldn't have you as my first or even my 10th or even the 100th. Having said that, Jenny unclenched her hand, expecting me to yank mine away immediately. It took me a moment to realize what she was trying to tell me, but I was a sailor who had been to Macau, Hong Kong, and Singapore, so I understood the reaction Jenny was humbly waiting for. But it only took another second to realize that I didn't care. I only squeezed her hand tighter. "I could be your last, Jenny. That's all I care about," I said. She began to tremble, and I pulled her to me without resistance. Sobbing quietly, she cried on my shoulder, and it seemed like a long time. A very long time she couldn't stop. Without lifting her head, she whispered her story to me, pressing her cheek against my shirt. There was nothing surprising in it, and I'd already guessed most of it as soon as the first realization came. Jenny had gone to the city, chasing her dream. But big cities are alive, insatiable and indifferent creatures that devour young and naive women by the hundreds. It was an ordinary story, starting with a dapper guy with devilish charm and ingratiating manners whose interactions with her had led to an arrest and 2 months in a gray, dark, and half-damp stone sack. After that, she wanted to leave, but there was more devilish in that man than charming, and she, like hundreds of others before her, found herself trapped, hopelessly trapped in the so-called gentleman's club. She had to sell the only thing she had, just to survive. After a while, tired of the hopeless and futile struggle for her survival, she began to look for a way to kill herself. She only gathered the courage to hang herself, and thus cut off the endless string of daily suffering. Jenny was saved only by a terrible gang war, as a result of which most of the club's guards were killed. In the ensuing turmoil, she managed to escape with a small amount of stolen money and returned home to hide behind its walls from the terrible dangers of life. For some time after this conversation, she continued to fight me. But her resistance was weak and only persisted because Jenny felt obliged to give me a chance to go away and leave her. Of course I didn't. We were married in the spring and settled outside of town in a modern Sears Model 1133 house on 25 acres of adjoining land. There she wove ribbons into her hair every day. I even asked a local seamstress to make more of them when my own ribbons from the Navy duffel bag ran out. She solemnly swore her allegiance to me, till death do us part. And she meant every word she said. There was not and could not have been a more devoted wife in the whole world. I saw her often watching me from the kitchen window while I worked in the fields and eagerly waiting for me to return to her. And when Jenny gave herself to me, she put her whole self into the act of our union, with sincere love, absolute passion, and everything else she had. In a way, I think it was proof to her that she was worth something. To me, but mostly to herself. Proof that she hadn't destroyed her happiness because she was able to pick up the pieces of what seemed hopelessly corrupted and turn it into a source of joy. I myself would never have believed that I could be such a happy person. And even Mark's ridiculous grin, which appeared every time he saw us together, was quite bearable, because he really was always there for us. When Jenny had Tommy, there were 3 of us. For 4 years, we were happy. My world came crashing down on December 7th, 1941, although it took me 2 months to find out. Many radio operators died and went missing during the attacks on Pearl Harbor, and it didn't take the Navy personnel officers long to find me. When the telegram arrived, I was out in the field fencing new plots. By then, our property had grown to nearly 75 acres. I was met at the door by Jenny, with eyes full of tears, who clutched in her hand a telegram from Western Union calling me to active Army service. I silently read the message. Radio operators, it seemed, were more valuable to the country now than farmers. "Jenny, you've heard the radio. I'll be teaching somewhere and I'll try to get home as soon as possible." I tried to reassure my saddened wife. "I wish you would. I can't live here." She put her arm around us. "Without you. It won't last long, a year or so, and we'll be done with it," I assured her. "Iya, I really can't do this without you," she whispered. Her voice was so fragile it sounded like it might crumble to dust in a breeze. Suddenly I realized she wasn't talking about the farm. I gently put my arm around Jenny's shoulders and drew her into the house, where I sat down on a kitchen chair and sat her on my lap. "Jenny, I'll be back. I swear to God I'll come back." She clung desperately to me, wrapping her arms tightly around me, her hot tears dripping down my neck. We talked for hours, and I tried to get Jenny to promise to stay strong for me. All she could say was, "I'll be as strong as I can be." I had to leave almost immediately, but I made Mark promise to look after her and Tommy, knowing that he would do his best. I soon learned that I would not have to teach. For fear of a possible Japanese invasion of Australia, our Catalina 4 amphibious boats had been rushed out to patrol the sea routes against a likely samurai landing force. These seaplanes required radio operators with a crew of 10. There was no time for additional radio operator training, and those of us who already had experience were quickly assigned to flying squadrons. We played some crazy game. We met our submarines in secluded bays, gave them secret codes, and in return delivered important reports to the command. And they searched, constantly searching for Japanese ships. Our bird had more hazards and close bursts versus chances of hitting a target than I could count. We were threatened by Japanese air patrols, technical glitches, and malfunctions, and once, in a particularly unpleasant moment, a lone Japanese fast patrol boat nearly finished us off while we were on the water surface. It was almost August when Lady Luck finally turned her back on us, and we were forced to splash down on the water due to a mechanical malfunction near the Philippine coastline. Our last radio transmission went unheard. We had been at the limit of our communication range the entire time, and by the time we realized we couldn't repair the malfunction quickly, our Catalina was already behind a dense layer of clouds, further limiting our reach. We spent the rest of the war fighting alongside Filipino guerrillas against the Japanese occupiers. Mostly, we were just trying to survive by simply raiding for vital supplies. There was no communication with the American troops, so we knew nothing about what was going on in the big world. Amazingly, despite the fact that there was only skin and bones left of everyone in our crew, we all survived, thanks to the help and incredible bravery of the local guerrillas. Similarly, no one in the Army knew about our little group until a roving American patrol accidentally stumbled upon us. That was sometime in the middle of 1945. After all the ordeals, one day we arrived in San Francisco, where we were welcomed with appropriate honors and paid 3 years' pay. The brass announced to the crew of our Catalina that we had earned enough points to merit an immediate honorable discharge from the Army. That's when I learned that I had been officially presumed dead for several years. We were all declared dead in action almost immediately after we disappeared. I sent a telegram to Jenny and another to Mark at Mrs. Strickland's house, and then got on the first train I could squeeze on, along with thousands of other soldiers and sailors returning home from the war. It took almost a week to get back to my hometown. A whole week of panic on my part. I knew how much Jenny depended on me, but at the same time I realized, as long as she knew I was alive and Mark would be there to support her, she would be okay. But the realization that she thought I was dead horrified me. I knew better than anyone how fragile and vulnerable she really was. And then, at last, I saw the painfully familiar outline of my town. Mrs. Strickland intercepted me at the train station. I can't imagine how she knew which train I was taking. She probably just met every train, looking me over from the moment my telegram for Mark arrived. I guess that's the way it was. I never asked. She sat me down next to her and told me about the disaster with Jenny after receiving that awful telegram from the military authorities, as she did about Mark's desperate attempt to save her. And then she told me about Gracie. The Secretary of the Navy regrets to inform you that after receiving the funeral, my wife held on as best and as long as she could, just for Tommy's sake. Our boy was the dearest thing in the whole world to her. But Jenny's inner strength was always based on we, the two of us. Without a dislodged pillar and the hope of my return, her mental state began to deteriorate, though she certainly fought it to the best of her ability. She had to get a job because she could no longer run the household alone. While she continued to live at Mrs. Strickland's boarding house with Tommy, she worked on a conveyor belt, making bootlaces of various styles, from military to the most common, in our town factory. Day after day, she fought with herself, but each new day gathered its ruthless harvest. The circles around her eyes grew darker and darker. She began to wear her ribbons casually, and then she stopped weaving them into her hair altogether. She spoke so seldom that almost no one heard her voice anymore. Mrs. Strickland, who looked after Tommy while my wife was at work, saw Jenny's soul falling apart more and more each day. In fact, Mrs. Strickland was just lucky enough to pay attention when Jenny kissed Tommy one morning and whispered, "Whatever happens, remember that I'll love you forever." Something in her strained, string-like voice, something in her stumbling, unsteady gait made Mrs. Strickland wince and become alarmed. As Jenny walked out the front door, leaving it open, and wandered languidly down the street toward the factory, which was only a few blocks away, Mrs. Strickland rushed to Mark's room and began pounding on his door, shouting for him to get up sooner. If Mark had acted slower, or Jenny faster, or if she had been better prepared, he wouldn't have stood a chance. Reaching the factory, Jenny tried to open the giant industrial cord winding machine, but the door of the cage protecting it was locked, more in case of unlikely sabotage than for safety. After futilely yanking on the door to no avail, Jenny dropped her hands and stared at it dumbly for a moment, then staggered back to the back room, where she grabbed one of the hundreds of cord cutters lying on the floor. She locked herself inside and, while the other girls screamed and pounded on the door, began clumsily, but with fatal determination, sawing at her wrist. In fact, Mark hadn't run so desperately since he was 4, but the terror in Mrs. Strickland's voice gave him speed. As Mark burst into the workplace in a final, panting sprint, limping heavily on his injured leg, frightened women workers, pale and sickly, watched him run forward along the conveyor belt. Mark was not a small guy, and the door that could theoretically have stopped him should have been much stronger than the one he slammed his shoulder into. Once inside, he grabbed my blood-spattered Jenny, knocked the bloody wire cutters out of her hands, and dragged her back to Mrs. Strickland's boarding house, and then to the farm. He stayed with Jenny and looked after her as I had asked him to. Mark split his time between working in the factory and on the farm, sometimes putting in nearly 20 hours a day. My best friend took care of my baby, took care of my widow. He tried to sleep in town, but eventually moved to the couch in the farmhouse and then to our spare bedroom. It was almost a year before Jenny found physical comfort in his arms and bed. Fragile and mentally scarred, she needed human contact, some reality she could lean on. And while the closeness that Jenny had with Mark wasn't the special bond that existed between her and me, it was enough to keep her in a state of mind where she could be a caring mother around Tommy. And when Gracie was born, it was further confirmation that Jenny was not a poisonous poison, not a worthless weed. She wasn't just another one of the proverbial Maitland girls. Jenny had told Mark she would never marry him because she couldn't do that to me, even if she had to stoically endure the angry, judgmental glances of the town matrons. Before she let me go on my way home, Mrs. Strickland had time to send someone from the boarding house on ahead to the farm with the message that I was on my way. Now, as I walked up the path to my house, more questions crowded into my mind than there were answers. Jenny's frightened look brought me to my feet, making me think for a moment that perhaps it was too late for us. The mere thought that I had to get back to her alive helped me through all the dangers and horrors of war in the jungle. The heartbreaking thought of losing her was thrashing around inside me and was truly unbearable. But there was no hesitation as she left Gracie with Mark and rushed from the porch to meet me. "John, she whispered in a broken voice, and again, as she had years before, her hot tears burned my neck. "Shh," here now, I'm back," I whispered softly in her ear, hugging her shuddering shoulders and stroking her soft hair with my rough palms, the scent so familiar. Eventually, I picked her up in my arms and carried her into the house while she was still mumbling, trying to apologize and explain. It wasn't as hard as I'd feared it would be to sort out the whole tangle. We stayed up that first night and many more after that, talking, and in Jenny's case, crying quietly from time to time. The deep scars, ugly across Jenny's wrist, served as a vivid reminder of what could have happened in the worst-case scenario. Those scars suppressed any anger toward both Mark and, even more so, little Gracie. There was no crime, no guilt, no repentance to appeal to in what happened at home while I was dead. Without Mark, Jenny would not have survived. The farm would have been lost, and who knows what would have happened to our son Tommy then. She told me that as soon as they received my telegram, Jenny and Mark immediately moved into separate rooms. Yes, they loved and supported each other, but not in the way that she and I had. I had no reason to doubt my wife or the truth of her words. I could see it in her eyes. Mark kept her afloat, but with me and for me, she really came alive and began to resemble her former self. Jenny herself feared the worst on my part, but after an almost incessant stream of her apologies, I told her that she had kept her vows. After all, they said, until death do us part. And after all, I had been officially dead for 3 whole years. Was there any anxiety on my part? At times, perhaps, but Jenny and Mark did their best to make sure that I didn't have the slightest cause for serious concern. Mark even suggested once, wouldn't it be better for everyone if he left? But I couldn't separate him from Gracie. Instead, I helped him build a house on the other side of the property, far enough away to have privacy, and close enough that he could help Gracie and me. When my best friend finally met the right girl, we had plenty of time to explain to her the singularity and complexity of our relationship. As for Jenny, she's living proof that even a Maitland clan girl can be faithful, till death do us part.